Okay, good morning friends, Shalom Aleichem, Bruchim Habayim. Today's shir is dedicated for the healthy, swift delivery for Ilanet Simcha Bas Leah. Hashem should give her Zara Chai V'Kayama in good health and protection. B'shat Tov V'Matzlachas. Okay. We have an epic topic today, if we could get through it. This is, some label this Haran Hayadua. Haran Hayadua. The well-known Ran. I don't know if you remember, one time we had a shir on the Hataz Hayadua. There's a well-known Taz that's given the appellation Hataz Hayadua. Well, this is the Ran Hayadua. It's a very well-known Ran. For those who learn Taruvais or learn Yaradeya, this is a Ran that comes up as one of the fundamental ideas in Hilchos Taruvais. So I'm going to try to put it up on the screen. And here we go. The Ran is discussing the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that if somebody makes a neder from meat and it got mixed with eggs, that if the meat gives taste to the eggs are asur. And if it does not give taste to the eggs are mutter. So machlokes the Tanna Kamma and Rabbi Yehuda, is it asur only if you say basar zu, or even basar stam? But according to everyone, if you say basar zu, it's for sure asur. That's the Mishnah on Daf Nun Beis Amud Aleph. The Mishnah said, Hanoider min habasar. Rabbi Yehuda said a story that Rav Yossi said a story that Rav Tarfon aser the eggs that were cooked with the meat. And the Chacham said it's true, but that's only when you say basar zeh. But everybody agrees if you say basar zeh, the egg are going to be asur, because since you asur the meat b'neder, so therefore the egg takes on the taste of the meat and it's asur. But let's think for a minute. How exactly is the meat asur? The meat is asur b'neder. Is something which is a neder asur forever? No. You can be matter a neder. You can be matter a neder. That would mean that a neder is Devarim sheish lo Matirin. There's a well-known rule in Taruvais, in Hilchos Taruvais, Davar sheyesh lo Matirin afilu be'elaf lo batal. Something that eventually will become mutter is not batal even in 1,000. Rashi in Masechta Beya says the reason for that, the reason why Devarim sheish lo Matirin afilu be'elaf lo batal, is because ad shetoichlenu be'isr toichlenu beheter. Why eat it when it's asur and rely on bittul? Why don't you just wait until the thing will become mutter? And when it becomes mutter, then it's mutter straight up. For example, chametz on Pesach is called Devarim sheish lo Matirin. There's no bittul, because we don't allow you to rely on bittul. Just wait till after Pesach. Anything that will ultimately become, or a beya shenolda b'yamtif that got mixed with other eggs, so we say there's no bittul, wait until after yamtif. That's a very, now, is a something which is asur mishum neder dvarim sheish lo matirin? Absolutely. You could go to a chacham and the chacham will be matirit. So the question is, how could the Mishnah say that if something that became asur mishum neder, it will give taste to something else, and if there's 60, then it becomes batal, and if there's not 60, it won't become batal, right? Because the Mishnah says, if it's ein benoy sein tam, then it's mutter because of bittul, but it's Devarim sheish lo Matirin, and Devarim sheish lo Matirin afilu be'elef lo batal. Yeah? That's the kasha of the Ran and many of the Rishonim. The basic answer that the Ran gives is, I'm going to tell you outside, and we're going to try to see it inside. The Ran basically answers that the din of Devarim sheish lo Matirin is not batal, is only min b'minai. It's only if it's the same species. But here we're dealing with meat and an egg, and it's different species. Min b'she'enoi minai would be batal by Devarim sheish lo Matirin. It's only by min b'minai that we don't say that we say Devarim sheish lo Matirin is not batal. But taruvais min b'she'enoi minai is batal. Now, what difference does it make if it's min b'minai or min b'enoj minai? What's the chiluk? The Ran says as follows. Could one davar heter become batal in another davar heter? No. There's an idea that when two things are similar, they can't cancel out. They just strengthen each other. So, if you have a davar isser and a davar heter, but the davar isser will become mutter, in a way it's like min b'minai, it's like heter b'heter, that it doesn't become batal. But that's only, so in other words, we know that heter b'heter doesn't become batal, so too, isser and heter doesn't become batal either, if the isser is Devarim sheish lo Matirin. But that's only min b'minai. But min b'she'enoi minai, and they're different from each other. So then we say, in this case, not only is it usher, not only is there a contrast in min b'she'enoi minai, there's also a contrast in the isser and the heter, even though granted the davar isser will eventually become mutter, but there's already a very big contrast between the two items. You see, the lamdus of bittul is when the thing that you're trying to be mavatel is very different from the greater mixture. You see, when they're the same, they strengthen each other. When they're different, then they cancel each other out. So here we have, in general, a davar isser that will become mutter cannot become batel because it's very similar to the davar heter. It's true now it's aser, but eventually it'll become mutter. But if it has another distinction, namely, not only is it aser now, albeit it will become mutter, but it's also min b'she'enoi minai, then it could become batel.
Doesn't min b'minai have the kula that it's mevatel of the right, as opposed to min b'she'enoi minai, you need a shishim?
So, min b'minai needs shishim also. Min b'minai needs shishim midrabanan. Min b'she'enoi minai needs shishim midairaisa. Min
we see midairaisa, so we see that min b'minai there's no kula because you're not much to mevatel it. But the Rav is saying that min b'minai strengthens each other. So with that svar, you would think that you need a stronger bittul to be mevatel.
It works both ways because min b'minai, in a certain sense, it's easier to be mevatel. Min b'minai, it's easier to be mevatel. And on the other hand, it's harder to be mevatel. Let's see the Ran. The Ran uses this to explain a very difficult rif. The rif brings the case of bread that was baked with meat that you're not allowed to eat with cheese, even though we usually hold that reichalav milsahi. So who cares if the bread was baked with meat? Why does it absorb the meat? But in a way it's davar sheish lo matirin, because you could eat the bread with meat. So the question though is, that's a case of min b'she'enoi minoi, where we say, why don't we say that since it's davar sheish lo matirin, it's batal because it's even min b'she'enoi minoi. Okay, let's see how the Ran presents this. The Ran is v'nesarev ba'acher yesh lo b'noisein tam. If you have the meat mixed with an egg and it gives taste, im yesh b'min ha'oser kedei litein tam b'shal heter, k'goyin deleka shishim. Let's say you don't have 60 b'shal heter, hareza aser. V'kasha lehu l'rabu sazal. It's a question to the Chachamim. Heichi amrinon hacha. How could you say over here, dim yesh b'y b'noisein tam aser, that if it gives taste is aser, which is mashma ha'am ein b'y b'noisein tam mutter. V'nedarim davar sheish lo matirinu. Nedarim is davar sheish lo matirin. Kinamrinon lekaman b'perek ha'noider min hayarak. Why is Nedarim davar sheish lo matirin? Misham de mitzvah le'ashtule alayu. It's a mitzvah to be matir midrab nasan. V'kaim alan dechol sheish lo matirin afilu be'elef loy batal. Why are we saying that if it's noisein tam, it's not batal? But if it's not noisein tam, it's batal, but it's davar sheish lo matirin. Says the Ran v'yishloimer dechi amrinon afilu be'elef loy batal. When do we say it's not even batal be'elef? Hani mili min b'minai. That's if it's the same species, it's not batal. Min b'minai, it's not batal. Aval hacha, but over here, ki katani v'nesari v'acher, when it gets mixed into something else, it's talking about she'enoi minai, if it's not the min. Dumya debatsim she'nespashlu imai. Like the case of the eggs, v'chol she'enoi minai, afilu b'davar sheish lo matirin b'noisein tam. So Asi, it's true. Normally, min b'minai only needs shishim midrabanan. Min b'she'enoi minai needs shishim midaraisa. The reason for that is as follows. Because when you're dealing with min b'minai, all you need is roiv. Because you just need to be mavatal it. But you don't need to be mavatal the tam, because there is no tam. In terms of taste, min b'minai, there's no taste transfer, because it's the same taste. So now you're just dealing with the entity. So as an entity, it's easier to be mavatal min b'minai. As opposed to taste, you need to be mavatal the tam. But as we're going to see, on the other hand, as an entity, it's harder to be mavatal min b'minai, because there is a shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds min b'minai is never batal. Min b'minai is never batal. The Chachamim say min b'minai is batal, and the reason basically is because the reason min b'minai is batal is because they have a difference. The difference is one is mutter and one is aser. But if it's davar sheish lo matirin, then there's no difference at all. Then basically what's going to happen is the Chachamim concede to Rabbi Yehuda that min b'minai is never batal, because now it's the same taste and they're both mutter. So there is a certain dichotomy. In terms of taste, min b'minai has less requirements. As an entity, it's harder to be mevatel. Okay, let's proceed. V'hainu d'tanan b'mesaches chala. Hanoisin sa'or me'isas chitim l'tech isas oirez. If you put the yeast of the dough of wheat into the dough of rice, im yesh ba tam dagan chayeves v'imla patura. Im kein lama amru hatavel oiser b'choshehu. B'minoi, that's b'minoi. If it's the same species, v'shaloi b'minoi, b'noisein tam. The tevel davar sheish lo matirin hu. Tevel is davar sheish lo matirin. But even though it's davar sheish lo matirin, it's only not bato b'minoi. But b'she'enoi minoi, it's batal. V'afil hachiktan nishlam yaminoi b'noi sein tam. V'achinami isa b'hedya b'yushalmi. Tigar sinon chametz zeh haklal. Hay Reb Shimon Omer Mishum Rabbi Shua. Kol davar sheyesh lo matirin. Kagoin tevel l'maser sheni v'hektish v'chalav. Lo nitnu by chachamim shir ela min b'minoi b'mashahu. Min b'minoi is not batal. Shaloi b'minoi b'noi sein tam. So we see that what Devarim sheyesh lo matirin, it's only a problem by min b'minoi, not min b'she'eno minoi. But ein lo matirin, like truma, you see tevel, maser sheni, hektish, all have heter. You could redeem it, you could sell it. Truma is ein lo matirin. Therefore, min b'minoi b'shel lo b'minoi, b'noi sein tan. Halin nidri, my ad ovad line. How do you treat nedarim? Kedavar sheish matirin or kedavar shein lo matirin? Says no mistabra mavidin kedavar sheish lo matirin. We treat it like davar sheish lo matirin. Natanion taman. Shazakin oikar haned meikara. A zakin could be oikar to begin with. Vaha masnisa avdalan kedavar sheish lo matirin. The Mishnah also makes it like davar sheish lo matirin. Shanoid min adav nesar b'achem yesh lo b'noi sein tam aser. Tifter b'min b'she'enoi minoi. That's only if it's a different species. B'davar sheyesh lo matirin. V'areza mufurish k'may shekasavnu. Basically, that's explicitly like we said. So let's just say very clearly. The Ran's kasha isn't there a rule davar sheyesh lo matirin is not bato b'elef? And the answer is that's only by min b'minoi, but not by min b'she'enoi minoi. We haven't really explained what the difference is. Why only min b'minoi and not by min b'she'enoi minoi? But as you can imagine, see min b'minoi, you can't be mevatel it. It's very hard to mevatel the same species. They just strengthen each other. And there's no distinction at all because one is mutter, one is aser. No, even the isser has a heter. So it's mamish identical. It's the same min, and even there's no isser and heter, because even the isser has heter. Masha'ein kain, if one is minoi, one is enoi minoi. So it's easier to be mavatel something when it's different. And between the fact that it's a different species and the fact that it's a little bit aser, that's enough. Now the Ran has a kasha on the Rif. Ulafika chikshu al harav alfes shakasa bel choysev hergin anasha b'inyan pas sha'afa imatzli, bread baked with roasted meat betanor. Okay, so you have challah and you have chicken baking. You're now to eat the meat. You're now to eat the bread with cheese. Why? But the steam that comes from the chicken is nothing. So why can't I eat this bread baking with the chicken with cheese? Hainu taima, yishum dahav davar sheyesh lo matirin. Instead of eating the bread with cheese, you could eat it with meat. So since it's davar sheyesh lo matirin, there's a way around it. Therefore, even be'elef laibato, mishamachi afilu be'elef laibato, and therefore you cannot eat this bread with cheese because you could just eat it with meat. But wait a second. But we're dealing with bread. We're dealing with bread and meat. That's min b'she'enoi minoi. Didn't the Ran just establish a rule that only by min b'minoi Devarim sheyesh lo matirim are not batal? But here we're dealing with meat and bread. Alma desvir leizal da afilu shaloi b'minoi lo batal. We see even shaloi b'minoi it's not batal. So let's set this up. First thing is the Ran asked, how in our Mishnah could we say that if it doesn't give taste, it's batal, but it's davar sheyesh lo matirin? The answer is because it's min b'she'enoi minoi. Namely, you're not dealing with two of the same species. You're dealing with meat and eggs. They're different they're different taste. Min b'she'enoi minoi. So, only min b'minoi by Devarim sheish lo Matirin do we say enoi batal. Not by min b'she'enoi minoi. And meat and eggs are different. Now, really in that case, there are two differences. One is it's a different taste, and the meat has an Isser Neder, and the eggs do not have an Isser Neder. Even though the Isser Neder, you could be mater, there is a slight difference on two accounts. One is a different taste, and one is you're dealing with Isser V'heter. As we're going to see in the case of the Rif, not only is it a different taste, the bread and the meat, but neither are Asr. You're dealing with meat. Meat is not an Isser. It's just something you don't eat with milk, but it's not a Davar Asr. So there, even though it's a different flavor between the bread and the meat, but everything is heter, then the Ran says that's considered more like min b'minoi. The svara that Devarim sheish lo Matirin are not batul by min b'she'enoi minoi, that's because in additional, you have another factor of mutter and aser. But in this case, all you have is a different flavor. You don't have any factor of mutter and aser. Here, he's going to explain this here. We're going to go down to V'li Nirin Divrei Rav Alfasi. Okay, let's see if we can understand this. V'li Nirin Divrei Rav Alfasi. The Ran says, I think the Rif is right, that bread baked with meat, you can't eat it with cheese. Why? Because of Dvarim sheish lo Matirin. What do you mean? But it's min b'she'enoi minoi. Says the Ran V'li Nirin Divrei Rav Alfasi. Listen carefully to this. The chit na'an hacha the davar sheish lo Matirin b'she'enoi minoi batal. When we learned over here in the Mishnah that davar sheish lo Matirin b'she'enoi minoi is batal. Hanimili kol she'asar achshav. That's only something that's asr now. Let's say isr neder. V'asr li is niter achaz man kinedarim. So mishum de kami ba'ili, because you could ask that, you know why we say it's batal? Keep into Rabbanan, according to Rabbanan, bakulu isure min b'sheina min b'minoi batal. Kamoi b'sheina minoi. You know, the Rabbanon hold, as opposed to Rabbi Yehuda, min b'minoi is always batal, just like enoi minoi. In fact, like Asi pointed out, min b'minoi is more batal than enoi minoi. Then maru chacham l'chalik b'davar sheish lo Matirin bein minoi l'sheina minoi. Why did the Rabbanon say that even though min b'minoi is always batal, but by davar sheish Matirin it's not batal? Umeiza tam v'kach niroli. This is what it seems to me. The following Ran is quoted throughout Yoredeah. The time of Shadavar. The Chazina l'Rabbanon l'Rabbi Yehuda. We see the Rabbanon and Rabbi Yehuda, the Afligu b'min b'minoi, they argue by min b'minoi, I batal ilai, whether it's batal or not. V'amrino b'perak ha'koimetz Rabbah. And we say in Menachos, the Shneim Mikra Echa Darshan. They both darshan from the same pasuk. Rabbi Yehuda holds min b'minoi einai batal, and the Chacham say min b'minoi batal. Where do they learn it from? D'chsiv v'lakach midam hapar u'midam hasa'ir. You should take from the blood of the bull and the goat. Now the blood of the bull is a lot more than the blood of the goat. She'afal pi shadam shel par meruba, kari le dam hasa'ir. Even though the dam of the bull is more, we call it the blood of the goat. Alma loy batal. So we see it's not batal. Why? But it's roiv dam hapar and miot dam hasa'ir. Why is it not batal? Because savar Rabbi Yehuda dahainu taima mishum demin b'minoi loy batal. Rabbi Yehuda holds this is the reason, because min b'minoi is not batal. L'fisha kol davar shu davar l'chaver, anything similar to his friend, einoi machlisha mevatlai, it doesn't weaken it or mevatl it, ela ma'amidoi machazkai, it strengthens it. So even though you're right, in the world of the Rabbanon, min b'minoi is more batal than min b'sheina minoi. In the world of Rabbi Yehuda, no, min b'minoi is simply never batal, because anything that's similar to its friend does not weaken it, but it's mavatal it. That's why the Rabbi Yehuda holds by all isurin, min b'minoi is not batal. For Rabbanon lo mashnu l'hachi, the Rabbanon don't agree. The Rabbanon say, this is not min b'minoi. It's Isser and Heter. The mikamaka min b'minoi. Oh, I'm sorry. The Rabbanon say you can't prove from here min b'minoi loy batal, because normal min b'minoi, one is mutter and one is aser. So by a fact that one is mutter and one is aser, it's min b'sheinoi minoi. It's only by dama par and dama soyer that there's no Isser and Heter. They're mamish both mutter. So that ain't no batal, because you're not dealing with Isser v'heter, you're dealing with Heter v'heter. So the Rabbanan say, I agree to you, Rabbi Yehuda, in principle, that things that are similar have a harder time being mavatal, but that's if they're completely similar. You're dealing with dama par and dama soyer, so they're the same, they're both blood, and they're both mutter. But in a different situation where one is mutter and one is aser, then it would be batal. Basically, the Chachamim say that min b'minoi is really like min b'sheinoi minoi, because one is mutter, one is aser. But if they would both be mutter, then of course we learn out from the dama par and the dama sar that it's not mavatal. But the Chachamim say, if it's min b'minoi, mutter and aser, but the iser has Devarim sheishel Matirin, so now they're the same min, and it's not mutter and aser, even the iser will become mutter, then it's like the dama par and the dama soyer, that it's not batal. That's the lamdus of why Devarim sheyesh lo Matirim is not batal. It's only by min b'minoi, because of a gezeras hakosov. The pasuk says v'lakach midam hapar midam hasoyer. So Rabbi Yehuda learns from there min b'minoi is never batal. The Chacham say you can't learn from there min b'minoi is never batal. A regular case of min b'minoi, one's mutter, one is aser, so it's like min b'sheinoi minoi. But if in that case the iser would eventually become mutter, then it's exactly like the dama par and the dama soyer, and it won't become batal. So Rabbanon lo mashnu l'hachi, the mikamaka min b'minoi, the aser the iser ein doimen zelazeh, kivin the chad aser v'chad shari, shein roi leilech acher dimyoinam be'etzam. The Chachamim say it's not fit to go after their biological components, that they're both blood. We should really define them by whether it's aser or mutter. So why by dama par and dama sar is not mavatal? Because they're both kosher to sprinkle on them as beyach. They're both mutter. Elahainu taima de dama par eno mavatal dama sar. Mishum de kivan de shneim oilen. Since they both work, koloimer sheksherim lezrika ein mavatlin zezeh. Dechihechi de Rabbi Yehuda azal achar dimyoin ha'etzem. You see, Rabbi Yehuda says you follow their biological component. Blood and blood is not mavatal. Meat and meat is not mavatal. So that's why Rabbi Yehuda holds min b'minoi is never mavatal, even iser v'heter. The Rabbanon go define something by whether it's mutter or aser. So even what we would call min b'minoi, if one is mutter and one is aser, it's really min she'enoi minoi. Azu Rabbanon achar dimyon ha'heter. But Ulafikach, kol shechalukin b'isr v'heter, if they're different in isr and heter, afilu min b'minoi batal. Even min b'minoi would be batal. The havale min b'sheino minoi. Ah, but by dvarim sheish lo matirin, then the isr is really heter. So it's mamish exactly like the dama par and the dama soyer. They're both blood, and they're both mutter. So too, if you have meat and an egg, if you have mutter meat and aser meat, which typically the Rabbanon say min b'minoi is batal, but if the aser meat is an iser neder and it's dvarim sheish lo matirin, then it's exactly like the dam apar and the dam asar. It won't become batal. Misham hachi amrina de bedavar sheish lo matirin not do Rabbana misham chumra lid Rabbi Yehuda. By davar sheish lo matirin, the Rabbanon are inclined to say like Rabbi Yehuda, the kivan she'ein davar zeh chalak min haheter lagamri be'isser v'heter, since the davar isser is not completely different than the davar heter be'isser v'heter, because it's going to become mutter. Sharei avhu soifel yos niter kamayu amrinon she'enoi bato b'minai dihachi have a damutuva, because now they're very similar. Now they're too similar. Chadash she'en shavim b'min, they're the same species. V'oid she'enan chalukin legamri be'isser v'heter, they're also not different in isser v'heter. Misham hachi loy batal, only by einoi minai, because einoi minai, you see, it's like this. The Rabbanon say to Rabbi Yehuda, we don't think you're off the wall. We agree fundamentally when things are similar, they can't become batal. It's just, you're not getting the point. By the dam apar and the dam asar, they're completely similar. They're the same species and they're both mutter. But if they're the same species, but one is mutter and one asar, they're different, so it will become batal. But we would agree to you that if the isser will become mutter, where it's the same species, and they're not different in isser v'heter, then they won't become batal. Unless it's min b'she'enoi minoi. Min b'she'enoi, so it's a different flavor, then even though it's davar sheish lo matirin, look, then we would say it's really different in two ways. It's a different flavor, and it's different in isser v'heter. Shemhachi loy batal ela b'she'enoi minoi k'dei she'oisei chilek sheyesh bein minoi l'she'enoi minoi. Listen to this. The small difference between the two in min and eino min, yashlim oisei shivoy shenitoisav kan, will compensate for the equality that they have, that even the isser is davar sheish lo matirin, mishum davar sheish lo matirin, fisha chiluk shebein aminon, the difference between them, sibas habitul, causes it to become batal. Here he says it explicitly like we started. The contrast causes the bittul. The hashivoy and the equality, noisein shaloyu b'telan, makes it that they shouldn't be batal. But hilkach koshu asar achshav, anything that's asar now, be'enoi chaser min isurai, and there's nothing lacking in the isser ela sha'as liyos niter la'achar zman, then oisei chisaron shel isser, that lack in the isser, namely that ultimately it will become mutter, kivan shumuat, it could compensate for the fact, it could be compensated with the min b'she'enoi minai. But let's just spell something out very important. In the world of the Chachamim, the ikar is not the min b'she'enoi minai. The Chachamim determine identity based on isser v'heter. And therefore, if it's all dependent on isser v'heter. And therefore, by min b'minai, normally, by min b'minai, by isser v'heter, it will become batal. By davar sheish lo matirin, it won't become batal. Why? Because now there's no difference in the min, and there's no real difference in the isser v'heter. But if you had isser v'heter, then even min b'minai, it would become batal. So which is the ikar factor? Is the ikar factor, we know by min b'she'enoi minai, batal. And we know by min b'she'enoi minoi. Let's just get that clear. The Chachamim say, everybody says, min b'she'enoi minoi, iser v'heter, then they're fundamentally different in both ways. Batal. Min b'minoi, iser v'heter, batal. Devarim sheyesh lo matirin, einoi batal. Why? The main difference is the iser v'heter. Therefore, iser v'heter, by min b'she'enoi minoi, obviously it will become batal. By min b'minoi, iser v'heter, it will become batal. By dvarim sheyesh lo matirin, min b'minoi, then you have no difference at all. It's the same species, and there's no difference between iser v'heter. But now let's go to the case of the rif. Remember the rif's case? Meat baked with chicken. You're not allowed to eat it with cheese. And even if the taste in the meat is nothing, even though the taste of meat in the bread is nothing, you can't eat it with cheese. What do you mean? Why don't we say it's batal? Isn't this min b'she'enoi minoi? Chicken in bread is min b'she'enoi minoi. So shouldn't the Chachamim say it's batal? I thought that dvarim sheyesh lo matirin is only not batal min b'minoi, but this is min b'she'enoi minoi. So this should be batal. Why does the Rif say it's not batal? Says the Ran, I told you why. Listen carefully. You're right, this is min b'she'enoi minoi. But in the world of the Chachamim, what is the main distinguishing factor? Is the main distinguishing factor min b'she'enoi minoi, different tastes? No, that's in Rabbi Yehuda. The main factor is the species. The main factor is the iser and the heter. Well, there is no iser v'heter when you have chicken cooking together with bread. They're both mutter. So then we say they're totally fundamentally different. That is then we say they're fundamentally the same. That's mamish min b'minai. That's mamish min b'minai. In other words, the defining characteristic in the Chachamim is the iser v'heter, not the different tastes. In other words, so far what we saw is the Chachamim say even if everything is blood, dam par and dam sa'ir, but because they're both mutter, so it's not batal. Why? It's not because they're both blood, it's because they're both heter. But if you had mutter and aser, let's say you had mutter blood and aser blood, then it would be batal. Why? Because that's called min b'she'enoi minoi. Mutter and aser are min b'she'enoi minoi. It's that Devarim sheyesh lo matirin impugns the iser. So it makes it that it's not really aser. So now you're going to need to come on to a different species. So then a different species plus Devarim sheyesh lo matirin would make a difference. A different taste plus an iser, that even though it will eventually become mutter, that will make a difference. But the main distinction is iser v'heter. Yeah, but what if they're both mutter? Then we'll ignore completely the fact that it's a different taste. That would be a classic case of Dvarim sheyesh lo matirim einoi batal. In other words, what the Ran is doing is, the Ran is inventing two possible ways for Dvarim sheyesh lo matirim not to be batal. One is if they're the same species, and one is mutter and one is aser. So if they're the same species, and the iser will become mutter, so now there's no real difference between the two. They're the same species. And what about the difference in Isser v'Heter? No, we impugn the difference between Isser v'Heter through Devarim sheish Matirin. But in a situation where they're a totally different taste, but they're both mutter, then that's for sure like the Dam Par and Dam HaSoyer, where they're defined as the same. In other words, in the world of the Chachamim, the main criteria of judging is this like min b'minai, that like, in other words, like this. Everyone agrees fundamentally, min b'minai loy batal, min b'she'eno minai batal. The question is, how do you define min b'minai, min b'she'eno minai? Rabbi Yehuda says you just go by the type. Blood and blood, not batal. Different species, batal. Dam par dam sar, not batal. Anything that has the same name, not batal. That's how Rabbi Yehuda learns it. The Chachamim say no, we're much more sophisticated. We judge things based on, we don't judge things based on their name, we judge it based on their, Isser v'Heter. So, when they are both mutter like blood, not batal. If they're both blood, but one is aser, but the Isser is Devarim sheish Matirin, also, we don't have enough of a difference. But even if they're different flavors, like meat and chicken, but they're both mutter, that's also min b'minoi, and it would be like the dam par v'dam sar, and that's what the Ran is going to fear us over here. V'oid, let's go by the reason. The more you're moisav heter, they're more machmir in the bitum. Since it's destined to be mutter, amru shalo yizbata b'minoi. V'kiven dekain koshu moisav oid heter sha'af achshav yesh lo shasa koshar roi lahachmir b'tulo shalo yizbata afilu b'she'inoi minoi. Okay, let's go to this line. Here's where he spells it out. Vahi de pasha fa imatzli betanor lahi de parak mashilin. Imatzli betanor lahi de parak mashilin damya. That is more similar to parak mashilin. What does that mean? Actually, listen to this. In the world of the Chachamim, as much as the Chachamim say that Devarim sheyesh lo Matirin won't be batal if they have the same name, it certainly won't become batal if they have different names, but they're both really mutter to begin with, namely meat. It's less likely to be batal, even though it has a different name, than if it has the same name and one is Isser, one is Heter. When are you machmir on davar sheish matirin? Only b'minoi. Loi machmirin alei b'she'enoi minoi. We're not machmir if it's enoi minoi. Avahi de pas shafai matzli. Betana delek lachmur alei b'minoi. Deloi shayich klali loi machmirin alei b'she'enoi minoi. Nimsa shloi hichmer by klal. When could you be machmir on davar sheish lo matirin b'minoi? There's more of a reason in the world of the Chachamim to be machmir, even though the case of the bread and the meat is enoi minoi, because they're both heter, so it's mamish considered minoi. There's more of a reason to be machmir there than to be machmir in a case of min b'minai a davar sheish lo matirin, because davar sheish lo matirin, it's aser, but yet it will have a heter later. This was never aser to begin with. Meat is not an isser; it's just you can't eat it with cheese. Okay, I hope this gave some some.
Even though in our case by Nedarim, there's no intrinsic issue, it's not a shtik chelev treifa, right? It's only that there's a neder extrinsically, or really the
Okay.
mutter.
First of all, true, but a neder isn't isser chefza, right? A neder isn't isser chefza. Elamai, it's an isser chefza that has a heter later, right? It's not isser chefza like a piece of pig. It's a superimposed isser chefza. Mashen kein meat is never an isser chefza. It's just something that doesn't work with other types of foods. The basic point is what the Ran is defining that it's not a wide-ranging machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda holds min b'minoi einoi batal, and the Chacham say no, just the opposite. Min b'minoi batal, min b'she'einoi minoi is harder to be mavatal. No, everyone agrees fundamentally. Things that are similar are harder to be mavatal. Things that are different are easier. It's just the question is how do you define similar? Rabbi Yehuda defines it the same species. So straight up, min b'minoi is never batal. Chamim have a very nuanced understanding. Chamim say the way to define min b'she'enoi minoi is iser v'heter. Now, it happens to be if it's the same species and it's Devarim sheish shel Matirin, then out species they're the same, and even out iser v'heter they're the same. That's not a good enough difference. But if it's min b'she'enoi minoi and Dvarim sheish shel Matirim, so the min b'she'enoi minoi, which is a very minor difference, will be mashlim the lack of difference because of Dvarim sheish shel Matirin. But if it's min b'she'enoi minoi, and it's not something that's and min b'she'enoi minoi, but now it's not just Dvarim sheish shel Matirin, it's not even aser be'etzem, then even the Chachamim will say it's not batal. Okay, Rabbi say, have a great day.
Stam kashas in the case with baking the bread with the meat. Why is that considered davar sheish matirin? A person wants to eat it with cheese. Meaning davar sheish matirin is that in all cases this item will be mutter. But here he wants to eat it with the cheese. Why should davar sheish matirin really apply?
I mean, it's the same thing with, let's say, an egg that's born on Yom Tif. Don't tell me eat it tomorrow. I'm hungry now, right? I'm hungry now. So we say as long as...
But tomorrow it'll be mutter for all purposes. This will never be allowed to be eaten with cheese forever. So l'chayra, that's really not davar sheish matirin.
I mean, it's just the difference between time and with what. The Torah is ad shei. Why rely on a leniency when you could eat this thing without that leniency? How? Don't eat it with that meat. Yeah. Yeah. Look, you have to review this.
Yeah.
But this is a very fundamental Ran. Just even before he brings in this last step with the Rif, why Dvarim sheish shel Matirin in the world of Chamim brings this back to the Dam HaPar v'Dam HaSayar. Okay, have a good day, everyone. Kol tov.
Thank you, Rav.
Thank you. B'suras Tovos, everything should go well. Kol tov.
Thank you, Rav. Thank you.
Recording stopped.